Today we'll be taking a look at the Kohler Freshman urinal, a urinal that's been made since 1970 and is still made to this very day. If you ignore the water usage changes, this thing has virtually remained unchanged since 1970, which is quite impressive. So let's have a look at it and see what it has to offer. So the overall design is very bland. Not really much to talk about, but it looks pretty new for a urinal made in 1970. The trapway opening is pretty standard with a circular opening, as well as a siphon jet. And there are the rim jets. Let's have a look at a flush. Not too bad. Now you can obviously tell this particular one I'm reviewing is older, so it has a longer flush. These things for Siphonic urinals hold up pretty well. Rarely do you ever see these things out of order, and they function very well if you give them adequate pressure and a decent sized flush. So I don't really have much to complain about. Let's have a look at bowl rinse. I will say that the bowl rinse is great, but you can notice that the top is a little bit missed until the very end. I noticed these corners here also kind of miss as well, but it's the top portion of the urinal. For the most part, it's pretty great. And that is the Kohler Freshman urinal, a pretty decent siphonic urinal that's held up pretty well over the years. For a urinal introduced in 1970, I will say it's pretty far ahead of its time, and quite impressive that it's barely been changed throughout all these years. But let's put this urinal into the grading scale. Let's grade it. While the overall design of the Kohler Freshman is simplistic and kind of bland, think about this. This urinal was introduced in 1970 and it's always looked like this. Now I'll pay attention to other urinals around that time period and you'll notice that they look a lot more nice and classical. This urinal looked kind of modern in comparison, but nowadays in comparison to some modern urinals and stuff, it definitely looks kind of older. It's got this weird in-between moment where it doesn't look that old, but it also isn't too new. So you can kind of say this is kind of a timeless design, which is kind of interesting. And the fact that they never updated this design is kind of fascinating. But at the end of the day, I'm giving it a 5. It still looks very simplistic. The flushes on these things are not bad at all. They actually flush out pretty well, especially older versions. But the 1 gallon versions also flush out pretty well too. I give it a 7. For somebody that only has 5 rim jets, this thing actually has some pretty good rinse. However, I noticed that the top corners and the top portion does miss some rinsing action due to that factor. Overall though, I give it an 8. For siphonic urinals, these things have held up fairly well, and rarely do you ever see these things out of order. These things can hold their own for a very good long time compared to something like the Kohler Barton or heck, even the Kohler Dexter. These things have held up fairly good, and rarely do I ever see any of these have any sorts of problems. Overall, I give it an 8. Let's talk about the overall value of this urinal, and let's see if it's worth buying to this very day. I don't think a lot of people knew what Kohler was cooking up in 1970, but they've introduced a very timeless urinal that has stood the test of time to this very day. And the fact that this urinal has lost popularity to some other Kohler urinals doesn't make much sense. Okay, maybe the Siphonic Dexter makes sense, but you're telling me that this urinal is worse than the Kohler Barton or the Stewart Hybrid urinal? Not even close. This urinal is better than both of those urinals. Despite the simplistic look of this urinal, it offers a lot more than you might think. Good bowl rinse, good survivability, good functionality, and a decent flush to boot. There is actually very little wrong with this urinal. Could there have been more improvements? Sure, I definitely think a couple more rim jets would have been nice. But overall, I am very impressed with what they've done with this urinal despite its very simplistic design and execution. And honestly, it really should be more popular. Would I recommend buying a Kohler Freshman urinal in the modern day? Absolutely. It's definitely a lot better than the Kohler Barton. It is a lot better compared to the Kohler Barton urinal and will rarely leave you with problems. Overall, I give the value an 8. The final score of the Kohler Freshman urinal is a 36 out of 50, which translates to a 72 out of 100. You know, it's kind of a shame that this urinal is flown under the radar due to stuff like the Kohler barn, which is so much worse. I would highly recommend getting a Kohler Freshman if you're ever thinking about installing urinals. Definitely choose it over the Barden, for goodness sakes. It's honestly a shame this urinal isn't as popular as it once was. Let's make this urinal popular again.